The disaster struck on June 14th, 1903. The San Francisco Examiner wrote the next day, "Where at 5 o'clock last evening stood one of the prettiest towns in Oregon, filled with happy people, now lies only ruin." The Heppner flood was the deadliest in the history of America's Pacific Northwest and one of the deadliest in the nation's history, and yet it is little known today, nearly forgotten history. Crosscut, a Pacific Northwest news site, explains, "In those days, people weren't inclined to ruminate about things that they were powerless to change." Nestled between the Columbia River and the Blue Mountains, Heppner's town website describes the town as one of the gems of Oregon, a place where you enter as a stranger and leave as a friend. Heppner is an agricultural community that Crosscut describes as not on the way to many other places, originally named Strandsbury Flat after early settler George Strandsbury. The online Oregon Encyclopedia explains that in 1872, Colonel Jackson Lee Morrow, in partnership with businessman Henry Heppner, built a store at Strandsbury Flat, thinking it a good place to establish a regional trading center. Morrow was eventually elected to the Oregon legislature, where he was instrumental in the creation of a new county around the town. The county was named after him, and the town, renamed after his business partner, became the county seat. The encyclopedia continues. Early immigration to Heppner was primarily from Irish and Swedish communities, with the Irish farming on the eastern side of Willow Creek and the Swedes farming on the western side. The Irish eventually became the predominant cultural group in the Heppner area. The town incorporated in 1887 and in 1888 was connected via spur to the main route of the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company. The 1900 census put the population at 1,196. The Cook County Central Oregonian explains that Heppner was a thriving community in the sheep, lumber, and wheat industries of early Morrow County, Oregon, at the turn of the century. Geographer Ben Den Ouden wrote in the online Oregon Encyclopedia that Willow Creek meanders through the center of town, a stream that normally runs only ankle-deep by mid-June. After leaving its headwaters in the Blue Mountains, Willow Creek enters a narrow valley through the undulating treeless prairies of the Deschutes-Umatilla Plateau, semi-arid region receiving less than 20 inches of annual precipitation. The rains that do occur often come in the form of intense thunderstorms that can dump several inches in less than an hour. Den Ouden wrote in a 2004 edition of the Oregon Historical Quarterly, after leaving its mountainous headwaters, the creek enters a narrow valley whose width never exceeds 3/4 of a mile, a kind of landscape often favored by early white settlers who wanted to ensure that their towns had a reliable water supply. The geography of the creek was not, however, unaltered, as Crosscut explains. In the decades and months before June 1903, independent people made a multitude of changes to the environment around the creeks flowing into the town. Most of those apparently harmless acts were minor, gradual, routine. Even the larger uses of land, such as overgrazing or tilling the fields, were so common that no one thought twice about them. Den Ouden writes that the spring of 1903 was one of the driest in memory for eastern Oregon, causing local ranchers and wheat farmers to worry over the fate of their crops and herds. In her 2009 book, Calamity, author Joanne Greenberg writes, "Everyone here wanted rain. Agriculture was the engine of Heppner's success, and everyone knew that wheat and a bountiful supply of hay for livestock were essential. Day after cloudless day, June had been abnormally dry. Some temporary rain Thursday brought temporary hope, but everyone recognized that it wasn't enough to save the harvest, and went back to wishing and praying for more. And as they say, be careful what you wish for." A visitor to the town, a Mr. Tooker, a traveling salesman and the employee of Fairbanks, Morris and Company, was quoted in the Portland, Oregon Daily Journal. "It was drizzling rain, and there was nothing doing in the town. At 2 p.m, I went to my room on the second floor of the Palace Hotel to take a nap. Everything was peaceful and quiet," Tooker said. "It was Sunday, and people of Heppner were in their homes, most of them preparing their evening meals. There was no thought of danger, and a warning that destruction threatened would have been but the cry of a madman to the ears of most." Mr. Tooker continues, "I don't know how long I had been asleep, but I was brought suddenly wide awake by a frightful clap of thunder." Den Ouden explains, "Sunday, June 14th, was another hot day as Heppner's residents prepared for family suppers or evening church services. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds were building in the hills southwest of town. At 4:30 p.m., rain and then hail began to fall. The rain in the area could certainly be intense, as the Central Oregonian writes. The area frequently experienced what locals called water spouts, which are short, fierce storms that release heavy rainfall, which runs down hillsides and canyons, producing raging flash floods. Still, the Examiner reported, nobody felt any alarm. It was supposed that Willow Creek and its tributaries would rise, as they had risen before, and then the waters would subside, leaving a broken bridge here and there, perhaps and possibly incommoding people who wished to pass the fords, but nothing more. Mr. Tucker reported that going to the window of my room, which faced up Willow Creek and towards the hills, I saw a great mass of the blackest clouds huddling over the mountaintops. From the time on, the roll of thunder was incessant and deafening, but the people of Heppner paid little or no attention to it. They thought it was but a passing summer thunderstorm. Until, he reported, it was too late to think at all. The San Francisco Examiner reported on June 16, 1903. The 1,250 or more people of the town were preparing for dinner. A heavy storm was on, the winds were high, and thunder roars that there was no unusual sound until, on the instant, the rushing wall of water swept everything before it. Then, on an instant, came the disaster, the Examiner reported. There must have been a terrific cloudburst a few miles above Heppner on Willow Creek. It is marvelous that such an amount of water could have come from the clouds, for the face of the wave that came roaring and grinding down the creek was at least 20 feet high. The Portland Daily Journal reported that the advancing flood swept down the main streets, sweeping all before it. Buildings collapsed like houses of cards and were broken to kindling wood, while their inmates, overwhelmed by the sudden catastrophe, could be seen fighting for their lives in the mad rush of waters, while many persons on higher ground stood helpless to save them. The Examiner reported the best buildings had been demolished and carried away as if they had been matchwood. The big trees bent and then tore out their roots as the water carried them along in its resistless flood. Against such a force, the power of man was puny and petty. The Examiner quoted B.A. McCatty. I was 2 blocks away from the residence portion of the town when it was engulfed. Several men were with me. It seemed to us as though it all happened and was over in a few seconds, although it must, as a matter of fact, have taken several minutes. The creek was roaring loudly because of the heavy rain which had been falling all Sunday afternoon, and the noise was increased by a high wind. Suddenly, above all this, I heard a mighty roar as though the very heavens were rending. I rushed forth, and the sight that met my gaze will haunt me to my dying day. A mighty wall of water fully 20 feet high was coming down Willow Creek. On its crest were houses, trees, fences, and miscellaneous debris. Its force was irresistible and swept everything before it. Houses which gave way at once floated along with it. Those securely fastened to their foundations were fully engulfed for a moment, only to break to pieces and go floating down with the rest. I could hear the shrieks of women and children in those houses, crying for aid as they were borne along, and with them the hoarse, despairing cries of men by their family's side, but unable to save them or themselves. But one building did withstand the water, the Palace Hotel. The Daily Journal reports that the walls of this brick structure shielded and protected some 200 persons. Mr. Tucker was part of the reason that so many were saved. The Daily Journal goes on. The quick mind of Tucker, trained in the School of Civil Engineering, was the first to grasp the strategic importance of the Palace Hotel building as a shelter in the time of storm. A brick structure on a stone foundation, broad and low, the Palace Hotel was as firmly built as a mountain fortress. From an upper window of this hotel, Mr. Tucker first caught a glimpse of the flood as it rushed on in its wild, unchecked fury, the journal explains. Instantly he ran into the street below, and every man, woman, and child in sight was herded into the building. Calling a little band of men to his assistance, Tucker closed and locked the doors and compelled all to remain within. Some cried and begged to be allowed to try to reach the hills, but Tucker and those who acted with him forced them to remain inside, and thus their life was saved. Every living thing remaining in the streets when the flood came was swept away to death. But the Palace Hotel withstood the wall of water, and those who afterwards went forth from it to succor the perishing were able to accomplish a vast deal of good. One of those was A.P. Bradley, a traveling businessman who made it into the Palace Hotel, and told the Daily Journal of the aftermath. After the fearful death-dealing, madly driven waters had subsided, I ventured forth, accompanied by several persons, about the hotel, and succeeded in rescuing more than a dozen persons, 7 of whom were women, and never believed such pathetic scenes could have occurred. For I found that after being saved, the poor women had griefs that nothing this side of the grave can heal. 6 out of the 7 had lost children, and would not be comforted. There were other escapes as well. The Daily Journal reported that George Conser and wife with Dr. McSword and John Ayers were at Conser's home. Seeing the approaching flood, Mrs. Conser begged them all to seek safety upstairs. And Dr. McCord and John Ayers ran from the house, Mr. Ayers to try to save his family. Both were swept away and drowned. Mr. Conser and wife narrowly escaped drowning. Their house was flipped downstream a quarter mile and lodged along the bank, allowing Mr. and Mrs. Cosner to escape. Robert Hind and W.W. Lippid, after floating down on some drift 2 miles, were struck with floating wreckage, Mr. Lippid being drowned while Mr. Hind escaped with some injuries. Lizzie Matlock was swept down and finally lodged in the drift and escaped. One young lady caught a horse's tail and was dragged ashore by the struggling animal. But many more could not escape, the Examiner wrote. Survivors say that the marvel is that anyone in Heppner escaped, so sudden and so warningless was the visitation. At one breath, men, women, and children who had been chatting and laughing found themselves in the resistless grip of the flood and whirling to their death. Crosscut writes that everyone in Heppner lost someone, and some lost everyone. Ed Ashbaugh returned from a business trip to Portland to learn that the flood had taken his wife, all 7 of their children, his sister and her husband and 3 children, another nephew, an aunt, and 2 cousins. The water also destroyed his house and everything in it. Dan Stalter's wife, Samantha, and 6 of their children perished. When Stalter struggled up from the swirling current, he found 9-year-old Lizzie clinging to his neck, miraculously alive. Through horror at the terrible spectacle of the flood, the Examiner reports, John Guglielmo, a sheep herder, had become a raving maniac. He and a group of fellow shepherds had sat down to a meal when they heard the rushing waters. Guglielmo managed to run to high ground, only to see his companions, who had remained near the stream, overcome by the terrible fate which he himself had so narrowly escaped. After telling his story, broken and incoherently, the paper writes, his reason fled, and he is now a maniac, unable to give a more exact account of what he witnessed. The day after the flood, a reporter from the Daily Journal described the scene. The city is a heap of ruins. Twisted tree trunks against which are piled masses of wreckage mark the residence districts. Scattered throughout the wreckage are the bruised and distorted bodies of the dead. Then Ouden summarized the destruction in the online Oregon Encyclopedia. By the time the floodwaters receded, most of Heppner's residential area was destroyed, and 2/3 of its homes were gone. The town's business district was wrecked, with all but 3 of the town's businesses demolished. Newspaper reports gave disparate figures for the loss of life from the disaster. Early reports placed the death count as high as 500 persons, but eventually 247 bodies were recovered, though many reports still list the casualty count as 251. Joanne Green Bird writes that Heppner also lost 141 homes and 40 businesses, and of course hundreds of horses and cows, pigs and chickens, bowler hats, wagons, roses and churns, quilts, cradles, pies, and even entire cellars. In the countryside, farmers and ranchers mourned for acres and acres of topsoil, for orchards, and for pasture. And another disaster followed. The flood washed downstream to the towns of Lexington and Ione and did damage to those towns, but thankfully killed no people there. But apparently, raw sewage from Heppner polluted wells in those towns, and Crosscut notes, at least 18 people died in the following months of typhoid fever. Owing to the number of people who died in the flood and the people who left afterwards, the 1910 census listed the population of Heppner at just 880. The online Oregon Encyclopedia notes that the town did not return to its pre-flood population until 1990. In 1983, after years of study, a flood control dam, Willow Creek Dam, was completed, intended to prevent such a tragedy from occurring again. In the aftermath, people from all over the area came to provide assistance, even though they had to walk several miles past the point where the railroad became inoperable. They helped to clean up the town, to find and identify and bury the dead. People from all over the state and nation raised a substantial relief fund. Crosscut notes that the Heppner flood was, yes, a story of nature versus human beings, with the human spirit, community, and tenacity to the rescue. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.